Welcome to the Great Reset Opportunity Report. I'm Chris Blasi. Today's guest is the co-founder and CEO of Meraglim Holdings, Kevin Massengill. Kevin's going to share with us today his perspective on several key components and elements of the Great Reset. These include the trade wars, the risk and probability of the U.S. being dragged into a shooting war, the probable collapse of the U.S. dollar, and the fate of the Federal Reserve. As an interesting side note, Meraglim's other co-founder is the renowned author and analyst, Jim Rickards. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Real pleasure to be here.
Now, Kevin, can you tell us a little bit more about Meraglim and the services it provides its customers?
Sure. So, there's a lot of folks that are looking at big data. There's a lot of folks looking at artificial intelligence, some of whom have been a little disappointed, partly because artificial intelligence is not as well developed as some folks would presume, and partly because we think they're asking it to do more than it can, right? We think confined to its actual use case, it can be invaluable. We think the mistake is to rely too much on the numbers. We think the magic is in combining human intelligence with machine intelligence. For example, our signature product we call Raven for a host of reasons, some of which would be obvious to folks that read Jim's Road to Ruin, which I highly recommend if your readers haven't read it yet. But effectively, Raven, this predictive analytic engine, starts with expert narrative. So unlike the quant models, they're looking for clues in big data sets for correlations, regressions, mean reversions. We don't do any of that. We start with the expert narrative. We start with subject matter experts who are humble enough to understand that markets are actually complex adaptive systems and don't lend themselves to being tweaked by bureaucrats or PhDs, no matter how well intended. We tend to view central banks and government officials as 10-year-olds throwing the dials of a machine they don't really understand, right? They're not dialing up a little inflation or dialing down some unemployment. They're 10-year-olds throwing the dials of a nuclear reactor. You take that expert narrative, you convert that into a cognitive map. It's a lovely word bubble. You could think of it that way. Then now you've built a model that better reflects reality, but it's so complex that an analyst or team of analysts can't keep it updated. So this is the right role for artificial intelligence. This is something a natural language processor like an IBM Watson or Quid or others can absolutely do. It can ingest 9 million books, articles, transcripts a day. It can absolutely update all the nodes, edges, and conceptual components of a cognitive map 24/7 in a way that no team of analysts could keep up with. Then, of course, over the top of that runs our secret sauce, which is our complexity science, our AI, which is the computing with words, fuzzy cognitive math algorithms that we've already built. Then what comes out the other end of that, of course, is the Raven. All of that's under the hood and largely invisible to the clients. What they're interfacing with is this fantastic, beautiful, extraordinary interface that we have being built by the same people that built Tony Stark's computers, right? All the technology you saw in Black Panther, the company that builds all that for the Marvel Universe are our design partners. That's who's doing that for us. Perception out of New York. Great folks. Sorry about the long answer, but in a nutshell, that's it.
Okay. Well, we're focused on the Great Reset, and it sounds like the timing of Meraglim is really ideal for what's happening in the world. So now I want to kind of tap into a little bit of your insight and expertise. So how would you describe the Great Reset, and how pervasive do you think its impact is going to be on markets across the globe?
So we, like you, share a thesis that what can't continue won't. And you can come at it from two directions. You can come at it from a practical standpoint, and you come at it from a almost theological or moral standpoint. From a practical standpoint, you cannot create wealth beyond productive work that you save in surplus beyond what you spend, period, right? You can't create wealth by kiting checks to each other, get everybody excited, pretend that that's somehow economic activity, call it animal spirits, which in any other endeavor would be laughed at, right? That's alchemy. That's pretending that you can create value out of nothing. That's alchemy's premise, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from a practical standpoint, it's just sheer nonsense. A 10-year-old thinks, well, why can't we buy it? You have checks in the checkbook, right? But adults know that a checkbook doesn't represent real wealth, right? It's just a claim on real wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So from a practical standpoint, we all know that governments juicing markets in all asset classes with hyperinflated currency is not a solution. And it can't continue. From a practical or theological standpoint, we know it can't continue because it violates the core economic law. And when I say law, I mean that word advisedly. I think of it as a law exactly the way you think of the law of gravity, right? If you step off of a 7-story building, doesn't matter if you believe in a God, if you believe in a creator, if you believe in the law of gravity, it doesn't matter what you think. You're about to learn a really important life lesson, right? It is inexorable. It is inevitable. You're going to pay a price. There's an economic law just like that, just as inexorable, just as inevitable. And it doesn't matter if you recognize a creator, if you understand where it came from, it doesn't matter. If you violate the law of economics, which is a really simple phrase, thou shalt not steal. That's it. If you violate that, there's a whole cascade of things that follow. You get a degradation of living standards. You get a loss of productivity. You get capital flight. You get a loss of the rule of law, right? Your court systems break down. All of these things kind of cascade down from that premise. A society or of individuals who reject the idea thou shalt not steal will have that outcome emerge, right? Mm-hmm. Conversely, a group of people or individuals or society that's organized around the principle in honor of thou shalt not steal will see a number of things emerge. You will find a court system that honors contracts emerge. You'll find a free market start to flourish. You'll find an increase in capital, which leads to an increase in productivity, which rises living standards, right? Now, no country's perfect, no society's perfect, but in general, you can stand in a society and look around and tell at a glance if you're among a people who are tending to honor the phrase thou shalt not steal or dishonor that or reject it, right? And the outcomes are inevitable. And then when they run their full flower, you look at these developments and we try to slap labels on them. We say, well, that's socialism or this is capitalism, right? I think that's nonsensical. I think what you're actually seeing is not something that somebody sat down and designed and then thought their way to. I think what you're seeing are people ex post facto applying labels to things that are actually results. Capitalism is not a system, it's a result. It's the end result of what happens when people embrace the economic law, the iron law of economics, as I like to think of it, right? That's a result. It's not a system. So the point for our listeners is 30, 40 years ago, when the United States decided to fairly aggressively begin abandoning the iron law of economics, one of the bellwethers of that was in the 60s, actually, with a rise of both welfare state policies and the devaluation of our coinage, right? Both of those were pretty big indicators. You start an inevitable drift. You begin moving in a particular way, right? Mm-hmm. And I used to think that you could demarcate two high water marks of any civilization. One was when they began building walls, because that shows a cultural exhaustion, right? Now, I'm not opposed to President Trump's wall for a host of reasons, but ask yourself, what would Teddy Roosevelt have done? He wouldn't be talking about building a wall, right? He'd be talking about invading northern Mexico, right? So societies who have reached their kind of ideological expansion limits start thinking about protecting what's theirs, right? The second thing that I thought was a great precursor, relevant for our conversation, is when they begin to devalue their currency, right? And I used to believe that was kind of the mark where government slipped the bounds of control and became, full on corrupt. And now that I'm older, I have much less respect for governments in general. I find that unsatisfactory. I actually find the governments don't lead anything. They're actually quite reactionary. So I've actually come to change that view. I believe that's the bellwether mark when a society, when the population becomes corrupt, when a significant plurality of the population decides they want something for nothing, right? And the government's just racing to keep up with that corrupt requirement, right? Think about, again, 100 years earlier, think what the population, in the 1900s would have done to a government that decided to strip the silver out of its coins and give them zinc, right? Dipped in nickel. They'd have tarred and feathered people, right? The fact that we didn't in the 60s is indicative of the fact that most people were in on the scam and just thought that somehow they were going to benefit from it at the expense of their neighbor. In my opinion, that's what that tells you. Now you come 40 years forward in time and look at what you've got, right? You have massive unfunded pensions, which is just simply an expression of city governments, municipalities, companies who have all abandoned their fiduciary responsibility to the future in order to steal from the present, right? For some local present, value for themselves, whether that was a re-election, whether that was a, better earnings per share for their bonuses that year, whatever the short-term thinking was. You can't have trillions of dollars of unfunded pension liabilities by accident, right? Somebody just didn't notice that, right? That was a deliberate decision. Again, these are all manifestations of the moral problem I told you, right? Governments that are running now globally 325%, debt to GDP, right? All that is governments stealing from the future who don't vote, right? They're not around. Stealing wealth from the future to spend today in a corrupt effort to buy the votes and stuff. And it's not just government corruption, right? This is corruption by the voters that think it's a fine idea. I mean, ask yourself, what would you think of a neighbor if you had an elderly neighbor and you knew that guy went out and loaded up 6 credit cards, got Visas and MasterCards, and just went high on the hog, started buying everything he could, just maxing them all out. And when you ask him, what the hell are you doing? And he shows you, oh, no, I put these credit cards in the name of my grandchildren. Screw them. Right? What would you think of that guy? Right? Well, that's us. That's the entire Western civilization. When you see that kind of debt numbers that are never going to be honored, right? They're going to be defaulted on at the expense of future generations. Think about the contempt you'd hold that neighbor in, and go look in a mirror. That's you and your fellow voters. So my point to all that is, it is inevitable. I am not aware historically of any government in history that self-arrested this decline, right? And so then you have to ask yourself, if that's true, and there's no reason to think we're going to be different, then ask yourself, what does that look like, right? What's a reset? What does a default look like? And actually, we have enormous body of knowledge on examples, because so many governments have done this through time, right? And it's only one of 2 ways it can happen, and it only ever happens in one, because nobody's got the moral courage to do the first. So the first way would be an honest default, right? Just to get up one day and go, hey, you screwed up. You trusted us. Every politician before me has lied to you. There's no way to pay this money, and we're not going to pay it. What are you going to do, right? Yeah, you think of it as the Argentinian model, right? We'll just default. Well, while that's the honest way to do it, and quite frankly, it's the only way to do it that would minimize the damage, because you stop it from getting worse, right? Nobody will do that, and for a perfectly logical reason. Not because they lack the moral courage, although that may be part of it, but because nobody will give them credit for what they just did. They'll just take the blame. The whole onus of history will now be on their head for being the guy that blew the system up, right? So nobody's going to do that. No political party's going to do that. So we always get the second option, which is hyperinflation, currency destruction. They didn't dishonor the debt. They honored it. Okay, well, what's your Venezuelan pension worth today in bolivars, right? But they paid it, right? So that's where it goes. That's where it always ends. It ends with the destruction of the currency itself, because that they can blame on everybody else. No, it's one of the reasons why you have shooting wars around this part of the cycle. Not just because the generation that went through the last great war is now dying out, although I posit that's a major part. But it's also because by now governments have mismanaged their economies so badly, they need somebody to blame, or they're going to be tarred and feathered, right? And so it's always easier to pick a fight with the other and get the government all, get the populace all rallied up and rah, 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 go get those bad guys. And oops, oh, sorry, your currency was devalued, 10 to 1, but damn it, we got the Chinese on the ropes. So that's how it will work, right? There'll be some kind of, if not false flag, I don't want to overstate that. The French have this phrase, logique de guerre, right? The logic of war, where after a while, enough of the elites just decide, yeah, we really kind of have no choice but to go get in a fight, right? And at some point, that idea just kind of overtakes the national leadership, and we're going to go get in a fight with somebody. And you can see the groundwork for that being laid every day, right? From the currency wars that Obama started in 2010 to the full-on trade wars that President Trump's kicked the table over with, right now. And those things almost always end in shooting wars because the logic is compelling, right? The reason President Obama thought he needed to do a currency war in 2010, it hadn't gone away. It's the same rationale behind President Trump taking on China. Right?
So Kevin, I have to say I think I know what your answer is going to be, but just specifically, what do you see happening to the debt-based US dollar? And I know no one can predict on timelines, but in rough estimates, how long do you think what you see is going to happen to the dollar? How long will it take to play out?
Okay, great. Yeah, there's three questions if I understand it properly. So the first question is the entire debt-based system will be destroyed and will be replaced. And it'll almost certainly be replaced in stages. Jim thinks they will go, my partner Jim Rickards thinks that they'll try a transition stage involving SDRs. I'm not sure they will or not, but neither of us think that would work for any period of time. Which means we will emerge fairly quickly onto a gold standard of some sort, right? And that's not because there's a whole bunch of them all sitting around and getting getting religion on gold and rereading their Murray Rothbard and their Ludwig von Mises and getting their hearts right. It's because of trust, right? When we've all blown up the economies and nobody trusts each other's banking systems and nobody trusts each other's currency systems, gold's the only thing we can trust, right? Which is why gold works so well in this process. So the denouement of this will be the end of the debt-based currency system and a return back to a gold and silver basis, only because it's the only thing that's tangible and real, and for all the reasons that gold's been money for 5,000 years. And you can see this clearly. This doesn't take a PhD in economics to look at this. Look at all the emerging markets, from whether they're asking for the repatriation of their own gold, right? Or they've been spending money hand over fist to increase their gold holdings, except some of the idiot countries in the West, like Canada and others, who are just morons. Or not morons, but that was a political leadership decision that's going to be reviewed historically as idiotic. And it's no reflection on the people. They didn't get to vote on that. So the first point is, we know how this ends, right? The whole currency process, the whole idea of fiat currencies all racing the bottom, that we've been in since 1971, when the world, for the first time in human history, comes off the gold standard, right? There's never been a time in human history when the entire world went on this monopoly money process, right? There was always somebody somewhere anchored to reality. And until 1971, that was the U.S. and the whole world, because they pegged to the US dollar and the dollar was pegged to gold, right? So we were on a quasi gold standard right up until Nixon decided to sever that for a host of political domestic reasons. You just can't keep hyperinflating your currency if you're pegged to gold, because eventually you get caught in the scam and the French send warships and go, hey, here's a bunch of your funny money, give us our gold. So that's the first answer. The second, about when, there's two ways to think about that. So for your investor listeners, I would tell you, think of yourself like a ski resort operator, right? You come out in the morning with a cup of coffee, and you and your friends look up at the snowpack, and because this is what you do for a living, you recognize instantly what is an unstable snow mass, right? Ask yourself what you do next. I can tell you, it's not sit around and try to do the math and figure out which snowflake's going to trigger the avalanche, right? Your problem is not which snowflake. Your problem is the critical mass. And so what you do is you call your foreman and you go start firing cannons or throwing dynamite or whatever the hell it is they do to bring down that snow mass, because it's going to kill everybody on the slope if you don't, right? Mm-hmm. That's out skiing that day. So for your listeners, the point is to not try to anticipate the exact moment, but to be self-aware enough to recognize what can't continue, won't, to recognize, to overcome the learned helplessness, both your normalcy bias, right? We've been skiing on this slope for years. That snowpack's not come down and killed us yet. Yeah, who are you guys to worry about this, right? That's normalcy bias. And then learned helplessness. It's really complicated. I don't know how to trigger an avalanche. Really smart people have got this. They got beards and they went to great schools and they talk funny. They got it, right? Absolute nonsense. I liken that to an image. Everybody's had this image. Think back when you were a small child, one of your earlier memories, stormy, rainy, dark night. You're in the backseat of a car. You're kind of nervous. It's scary. And you look up, your dad's driving. My year group cohort, he's smoking a cigarette. and you think, well, he knows what he's doing. He knows how to get us home. And you just go to sleep, right? Every kid's got that memory at some point, right? Just relaxing and trusting in the adults or parents around them. The problem with that is there are no adults in government. There is no adult authority figure that absolutely understands what's going on. They don't know. And if you knew what they were thinking at 2:00 in the morning, staring at their ceiling in the dark going, oh my God, what do we do now? Right? You'd understand. You cannot just sit in the back seat of the car and go to sleep, right? That means you have to take mental ownership of this situation. You have to figure out what you have to do to protect your family. And it's pretty straightforward. You have to get your assets away from that avalanche, because the avalanche isn't going to kill everything, right? Mountain's still there when it's over with. Trees are all still there. What gets wiped away are the tertiary level assets, the stocks, the bonds, the pensions, the derivatives, the paper contracts that all emerge when a society's got sufficient surplus energy, right? We had futures contracts in Babylonia, right? It's not unusual and it's not unimportant. But when you have these system resets like this, it's those assets that are destroyed. So what you want to do is get toward primary assets and away from tertiary. Primary is just think what God gives us, right? So you got coal in the ground, you got fish in the sea, you got cattle on the hills. That's primary. Secondary wealth is what you do with that, right? You turn it to beef stocks, you turn it to power generation, right? So the closer you can get to secondary and primary elements of wealth or real value, the safer you are. Because the apartment buildings will still be here the day after that. Productive companies will still be functioning, although they may suffer some logistics supply chains breakups. So to the extent that you can get your 401ks transferred to a self-directed IRA and out of equities and bonds and put it in gold and silver bullion, great. You should be able to sleep a little better at night. To the extent that you can transfer some paper assets and buy some rental homes or some multifamily apartment, keyword being real estate, right? that's a value, and you put yourself and your family on the right side of this wealth transfer, because wealth's like energy, right? It doesn't go away. It just changes ownership. Right?
I have to ask, because a great point when you talk about triggering the avalanche. Home at here, how do you see the Trump administration in regard to the Fed as a protagonist or an antagonist, which could be help push that, or trigger that avalanche?
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe they're an antagonist, and I believe that for two reasons. Now, first of all, I'll tell you straight up, I'm a big fan of the president. I think what he's done so far is designed to help the country. My only concern economically, and it's a big one, is that he and his advisors don't understand what's coming. And the proof for me of that is that he should have never backed off his talking points from the campaign. What he should say was, I'm delighted to see the market hitting new highs. I'm really pleased that our regulatory slash and income tax changes have helped, but don't be confused. $21 trillion of debt, $220 trillion of unfunded liabilities. We still face a hell of a mess. And to my mind, the fact that they didn't do that meant they don't really understand the risk they face, right? Otherwise, because now, having taken credit for a frothy, bubbly stock market, he's going to take the blame for the correction. And that was a decision they made, which tells me they don't understand the risk, right? So that I found alarming. The reason I think he's the antagonist of the Fed is twofold. One, he put Andrew Jackson's photo in the White House, right? Remember what Andrew Jackson said he wanted on his epitaph, on his tombstone?
He was no fan of the Fed.
He killed the man who killed the second bank, right? He killed the bank. That's what he wanted on his tombstone, because he understood the danger of that central bank. Well, today that we have the third U.S. central bank. It calls itself the Fed for marketing reasons, but it's just the third iteration of that same, banking cartel. And I believe one of Trump's core goals is to kill that or rein it in. I think that was the signal he was sending by putting up Jackson, right? Wasn't because he was happy about Jackson's Cherokee policies, right? Jackson's most famous thing, other than being a tough, eccentric, crazy son of a bitch, which is all a good thing for Trump too, but is his antagonism toward the Fed. And now, from just a base political standpoint, if you were in Trump's shoes, who would you begin to stake out as the scapegoat for this, right? It's Powell. It's the Fed. And you already see that started, right? So you see the Trump administration starting to lob, tweet grenades in the Fed's direction. In my opinion, I think they now realize some of the risk we face, and they're already queuing up to put the blame on the Fed where it properly belongs.
Well, it does, because, as you pointed out earlier, all the ill-gotten and, not natural and fair gains and wealth creation, at the core of all of that, none of that is possible without a fractional reserve banking system.
Correct.
Run by a central bank.
Absolutely.
That's why gold and silver have been the enemy to those organizations, because it's honest money.
Correct.
And there's things that cannot happen when you're in an honest money system.
Absolutely. So ask yourself, under an honest money system, would the 7 wealthiest counties in the United States surround Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, there's so much anecdotal evidence that that should be waking people up, that you don't need great detailed analytics on simple things like that to understand there's something wrong when the public servants where they live represent the wealthiest part of the country. Correct.
And so basically a bet on gold or silver is simply your hedge against the idea that central banks and governments can manipulate markets for the long haul, right? And it's just simply not true. Here, let's take an example. In the 70s, if you and I were brilliant mathematicians in the Soviet Union, there's only really 2 areas we're going to go. We're either going to go into defense and space work, or we're going to go into the Bureau of Economic Planning. as they put the smartest mathematicians they could at this. It was an enormous challenge. Now imagine this. Once a month, you and I, if we're in charge, are responsible to take stacks of papers, pre-computers, right? Pencil and paper. And we're going to set the prices on 2 million line items a month. Hey, Chris, what do you think milk ought to cost? I don't know. Make it Y. Hey, Chris, what about iron? I don't know. What did we charge for coal last month? I mean, literally, that's how it was done, right? They made up prices. Now they have formulas. They, rooms of formulas. Except if you went to the left edge of the equation, bullshit. All total assumptions, right? And then a pretense of math after that, right? Now, the reason I mention that is because everybody just laughs at the idea, right? Of course, a controlled economy can't work. It's just silly. It's Hayek's fatal conceit on steroids, right? You're not God. Nobody has enough data to replace the market. Now look at what we're doing in the West. We're not setting line items on 2 million items. Oh, no, we're smarter than that. We're more efficient. Oh, no, our masters, our central planners are setting and manipulating the price of the one thing everything else is priced in, the price of the currency itself, right? Mm-hmm. Way more efficient, but it is exactly the same hubris. It is exactly the same impossible task. The Fed has no more idea of what the actual interest rate should be than you and I would in the 70s, knowing what price to set for coal or iron ore in the Soviet Union. They have no clue what they're doing. And so because you've divorced yourself from price signals, which interest rates are just simply a price signal, filtered across the entire world of people that are interacting with dollars, and thereby an accurate measure in the market, when you strip that away and decide, for political reasons, we can manipulate that, we can juice that up, we can jack it down, right? all they're doing is building a bow wave of a market response that will blow them out like a tsunami when it resets. And that's how you find yourself in the situation we're in now. So the point for your investors is the critical state's already here. The question of when it happens, in my opinion, there's two ways to know. And in my opinion, we're already in it. I think it's already started. Look around the world right now and look at what's happening in the emerging markets. Look what's happening to their currencies. Look what's happening to their interest rates. That contagion is already sweeping the world. Last week, I'd have told you, look at Venezuela, Argentina, and Turkey. Today, I'd add Brazil, Indonesia, right? Look at what's happening to the emerging markets. And that's where these things always start, right? They always begin. Next, it's going to roil China. Wait till you see what hits China. And then what's going to happen from a process standpoint, it'll roil across, it'll hit while we're asleep. London will be in a meltdown. Our brokers and stockbrokers will be getting calls at 4 a.m. frantically, and you're going to wake up to a bank holiday. Markets in free fall, stock limits limiting down, and that is not the time for you to be calling your broker and going, hey, I think I need some exposure to the silver. You're not going to get it. You won't get it at any price, right? There'll be a price quoted. You won't get any, right? It'll be too late. And so, in my opinion, we're in that now. It's already started. That's why you're seeing the emerging market meltdown.
And I agree, Kevin. I think when the history books are written, the date of the start of the Great Reset, it's already passed. We're in it.
Oh, yeah, we're past that. That's exactly right.
It's just not obvious to the masses. And unfortunately, history always tells you the most people find out after it's all done, right? And unfortunately, then they're the victims of that. So I just want to wrap up by saying I want to thank you for sharing some really great insights and being very frank and very candid with your views. But I also want to let people know, if they want to learn more about Meraglim, how can they do that? What's the best way to do that, Kevin?
So we're on social media. You can find us at Meraglim AI on Twitter. Jim writes extensively there as well, Jim Rickards. You can find us on our website at meraglim.com, MERAGLIM. You might like the name. Everybody's heard the story. Nobody's heard the name, which I find charming. So in Numbers chapter 13, Moses has to assemble a reconnaissance unit, and he picks the crown princes of each of the 12 tribes, and he sends the 12 crown princes into the promised land for a 40-day reconnaissance, right? Everybody knows the story. 10 come back famously panicked at the risk. 2, Joshua and Caleb, famously excited about the opportunities, right? The name in Hebrew of that reconnaissance unit is the Meraglim, anglicized Meraglim. So everybody's heard the story. Very few people recognize the name. And Jim and I thought it was a fantastic, analogy for what we're doing for clients. So go to meraglim.com or meraglim.com if you got your Hebrew game on. And there's a ton of work there. There's a great bibliography if you want to read more about what we're doing. There's a fantastic blog. We write and publish an awful lot. And so that's how to follow us.
Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your insights and your forecasts. And we look forward to having you on again soon as we chronicle and track the Great Reset.